All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Ask the Experts program, Preserving Voices, an Introduction to Oral Histories and Community Storytellings with Molly Murphy. I'm Chrissy Clausen, the Programs and Communications Manager with the Chestnut Hill Conservancy, and I'm so glad you're joining us. The Conservancy is a community educational center, archive, land trust, and advocate. Our mission is to conserve, preserve, and celebrate history, architecture, and landscapes in Chestnut Hill and the Lower Wissahickon watershed through inclusive and proactive community engagement and stewardship. Our Ask the Experts series offers free programs that provide practical advice, practical and expert advice on caring for historic homes, landscapes, and collections. Tonight's event, presented as part of Archives Month Philly, continues that tradition. This evening's program is made possible through the generous support of our sponsors, Chubb, our lead sponsor, our general year-long sponsors and Conservancy members, Ace Hardware Home Services, our event sponsor, and E.G. Rull Jr. Landscape Design, our supporting sponsor. Thank you for making this program possible. I have the privilege of working alongside our program committee, including its co-chairs, Jean McCoubry and Rob Fleming, who collaborate with staff to organize programs like this evening's event. Tonight's program was the top publicly voted Ask the Experts topic during a community engagement session we hosted in April. And we're proud to present it this evening with Molly. Ask the Experts is offered in collaboration with our dear friends at the Chestnut Hill Community Association. And tonight, its Executive Director, Ann McNiff, will say a few words in just a moment. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. Please feel free to keep your cameras on, but do mute yourselves. Use the chat to introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from, and to submit your questions throughout the program. We'll gather questions for the Q&A portion later this evening. After I speak, you'll hear from Ann, followed by Chris Wilson from Ace Hardware Home Services. Then we'll welcome Molly Murphy for her presentation. Following her talk, Alex Bartlett, the Conservancy's curator and archivist, will briefly connect tonight's topic to our archives. And then Rob Fleming, our program co-chair, will moderate the Q&A with Molly and Alex. After the Q&A, our Executive Director, David Guest, will share a few closing remarks. But finally, I hope you'll join us again for our next event, which is next week. We have an Ask the Experts on October 30th titled The Art of Protection, and our upcoming Discovery Series program on November 13th. Details are at chconservancy.org. And now I'd like to welcome Ann McNiff from the Chestnut Hill Community Association.
Thank you, Chrissy, and welcome everyone. We are very grateful for our partnership with the Chestnut Hill Conservancy on the Ask the Expert series as part of the CHCA's mission to improve the quality of life in Chestnut Hill and create opportunities to bring community together. This is a perfect partnership in bringing these topics and others to the community at large, and we especially want to thank the Conservancy for including us. I, at this time, would like to welcome Chris Wilson, who will have a few words.
Thanks, Ann. Appreciate it. I'm Chris with Ace Hardware Home Services, previously Unique Indoor Comfort. A lot of you probably know us as the green and gray trucks that have been in the neighborhood for many, many years. I've had the pleasure of working in the Chestnut Hill community for almost 20 years now, working with homeowners on many heating and cooling projects, updating and modernizing many buildings and businesses in the area, including George Woodward Company, Bowman Properties. And it's been our mission to be the best, most trusted provider of home preservation services in the world. And that's really something that I'm passionate about. And it's what's made our relationship with the Conservancy so great. To be able to share the work that we do and be introduced and to talk with and help so many of you who follow the Conservancy and attend events like this. I actually had the pleasure of having a little sneak peek of the presentation yesterday, and it was just so great to tie together so many of these properties and these buildings and these structures and the businesses and people I know and work with. and hear a little bit about their history. So I'm excited for everyone to be able to do the same with Molly this evening. A few introductions for tonight's event. The Conservancy's curator and archivist is Alex Bartlett. Alex will join us, is on the call now, but will join this evening for a Q&A after the program. And Rob Fleming, the Conservancy board member and program chair, along with Jean McCoubry, who will moderate the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. I had the pleasure of, excuse me, our speaker. She has worked in the broadcast media realm for over 25 years. She spent much of her time with NPR's Cultural and Programming Division, earning 2 Peabody Awards. Molly has produced acclaimed series such as Jazz Profiles with Nancy Wilson and Wynton Marsalis's Making the Music. She's also conducted interviews for the Smithsonian's Jazz Oral History Program and produced programming for the NEA Jazz Masters Fellowship Awards. Please join me in welcoming Molly Murphy.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that introduction. And hi, everyone. As Chris said, I was a producer in the radio world for quite some time. I'm now retired. I primarily produced music programming, some classical, but mostly jazz. And I just had the remarkably good fortune to get to interview many, many really fascinating people. Historians, critics, and musicians, mostly the elder statesmen of American jazz. But I got my start as an audio documentarian when I was 16. And I had a giant dual cassette boombox radio that I got for my 16th birthday. And I recorded my dad snoring one night. And I thought it was so cool that I could actually do that. But he did not agree at all. And of course, that tape is long lost. But tonight, I want to begin by playing another piece of tape that's of great personal significance to me. I did not record it. And this is kind of amazing. I just stumbled upon this. A couple of months ago, I was just surfing the net, as one does, and kind of randomly, actually kind of impulsively decided to do an online search of my grandmother, who died in 1980, so a very long time ago. And I typed her name into the search engine, Tessie Buckley Murphy, and then I added Felton, Minnesota, which is where she lived. And to my surprise, a number of things actually popped up. And the very first item was oral interview of Tessie Murphy from Minnesota State University, and it was recorded in 1974. And from what I can gather, I think a local student interviewed my grandmother for a college project that she was doing on, quote, prairie women. So I would like to begin by playing a 90-second clip from that 1974 interview in which my grandmother is telling a story about driving a team of horses when she was just a teenager. And I think the story was set around 1905. Anyway, she offered assistance to the town butcher, who was distressed because he needed to get his cowhides to market in a neighboring town about 20 miles away. And whoever was originally going to do that for him backed out. So my grandmother stepped in. So Chrissy, if you can play Grandma Tessie.
I can take the hides. I know how to drive horses. My father had beautiful horses, and he taught us all to drive. So he loaded up a Democrat wagon, you know, these old platform buggies that had a back end, you know, that you could load up like a pickup, and a seat up on the front. It was a prairie road. There'd be a homemade wooden sign and say, Wales, 18 miles, or something like that, you know, and it would point an arrow which way to go. So I got to Wales, and I sold the hides, and I bought the things he wanted and started back. But on the way back, I ran into something that I had never seen or never heard of, but a lot of other people have, and that was the swarm of flying ants. And they lit on the horses, and the horses were just wild. They were scared to death, you know, and they were biting them, and they'd switch their tails, and they couldn't reach up to get them all off of themselves, and the horses were running away with me. And I thought, well, I'll just keep them in the road and let them run till they get tired was all I could do, because I wasn't strong enough to, jerk them back on their haunches like a man would. So I just pulled on the reins as hard as I could and let them run. And they ran and ran and ran and ran and ran. And sometimes I'd think they'd bounce us out of the buggy, but they didn't. But when I got home, the horses were all covered with lather, white under the harness, because they'd sweat so much and been so exhausted that he knew I'd been driving awful hard. But when I told him about the swarming ants, why, then I was a great hero, and they all thought, oh, she's quite a gal.
So I was 6 years old when that recording was made in 1974. Yet here is my Grandma Tessie, over 50 years later, captured for posterity, sharing a snippet of her life as a prairie woman with me, and now with all of you and anyone else who ever stumbles across that link. I find it just incredible. And I thought it might be interesting to share some of my observations when I hear this. The first time I heard it, of course, I burst into tears. The sound of her voice is just as I remember it. And again, this is from a long time ago. She died in 1980. But I remember her voice, her rural Minnesota accent, her laugh, her general demeanor. And in other parts of the interview, I can actually hear her daughter, my Aunt Vivian, who very sadly was a paraplegic, and she was confined to bed. But I can hear my Aunt Vivian commenting during the interview and kind of prompting my grandmother about this and that. And based on where her voice is coming from, sort of at the end of the room, I can tell exactly where my grandmother was sitting, which was at her little dining room table. And I can see the interior of their house. I can see the photographs arranged, all along up the staircase. And I just remember the feeling of that house. And, these are all details that have just been lodged deep in the recesses of my brain until I heard my grandmother's voice. And therein lies the power of oral histories. For me, there is something kind of magical about listening to a simple recorded voice. It can just be so intimate, and it just kind of draws you in. We hear so much, noise and newscasts with a lot of different sounds, but when you just hear a voice, it really grabs me. But you get a snapshot of a person's essence as expressed through their choice of words, through their pace, through their attitude. And it's really a window into their thoughts and experiences. And it's a window into the period when it was recorded and the period or periods of which they speak. And that is what captivates me as I conduct recordings on behalf of the Conservancy with members of the Chestnut Hill community. And I'd love to share some of that tape tonight. And I thought I would start with 4 voices of our Chestnut Hill Business District. And I think that some of you will know some of these voices and or certainly the businesses that they highlight. So the first is Russ Gowdy, who runs Killian Hardware, which was founded by his great uncle and then eventually passed on to his grandfather and then father and now to Russ. And one note, when you listen to this, you may be able to detect that Russ is actually wearing a mask during the interview because it was recorded in the fall of 2020 during the pandemic. So it's a little bit muffled, but not bad, all things considered. So Chrissy, if you can play Russ Gowdy.
My name is Russell Conwell Gowdy Jr., and I'm the owner of Killian Hardware. I would say I never ruled out the possibility of working there, but I actually didn't know I was definitely going to do it. I mean, I worked there when I was 5 years old a little. It was sort of more like play, though. Yeah, I mean, I learned to make keys at a very young age. I had to pull out the drawers of the key machine to climb up on top of the cabinet to reach the keys. And then I would actually stand on the bottom drawer while I was making keys. So yeah, I was like 5 years old making keys. I remember right across the street, that was Terry's Lamps and Shades. And then Robertson's, of course, has always been on that other corner. And then where the Philadelphia Print Shop is now, That was the building that was the former location of Killian Hardware before Killian Hardware was in its current location. So we moved right after Prohibition started in the early 20s. And Donat's Hotel was on the corner where Killian's is. I think their main money-making business there was the saloon on the ground floor. So when Prohibition started, they didn't have much business left. There was a man who only passed away very recently. His name was Charlie Cassell, and he grew up on Highland Avenue. And he often told me of his grandfather giving him 5 cents and an empty bucket, and he would carry it down Highland Avenue and get it filled up with beer for 5 cents, and then he would carry it back to his grandfather when he was a little boy. So they sold beer by the bucket.
We need to find someone who can sell beer by the bucket again, I think. Anyway, now every time I go into Killian Hardware, I walk the aisles, kind of with this awareness of the generations of family that built that business. And I also, anytime I get a key made, I think of Russ as a little kid learning to do that. So it's very special. And the same situation kind of applies to the next clip. And I'm not going to do an introduction because she does such a good job of doing it herself. So Chrissy, can you please play Anne McNally?
My name is Anne McNally, and my sister and I, Meg, run McNally's Tavern. And McNally's will be having its 100th anniversary next year. I've been there just about 40 years, and my sister is not too far behind me. And we grew up here. We grew up here on Ardley Street. My grandmother lived around the corner on Evergreen. My other grandparents lived on Mermaid. And it's nice to be able to say I've lived here my whole life. I love being a part of a small community that has had its ups and downs, thriving times, and then difficult times, to see the community working together cohesively to make shopping and living here so special. So we opened in 1921. Of course, I wasn't there, but the reason that we are here in Chestnut Hill is because of the end of the trolley turn here. My great-grandfather, he was the driver of the trolley, and the 23 was his line, said to his wife, Rose, there was nothing to eat out here. And so Rose thought, and they rented a shack. We have a copy of a canceled check. They paid $25 a month for a corrugated shack that was right connected to the trolley turn, and they ran McNally's Quick Lunch. She made the food, and I think it was pretty simple fare, and there's some cakes. There's a big cake container on the bar, which is the same bar that we have in McNally's now when we moved across the street. So that's why McNally's is located where it is.
So Anne and her sister Meg are the 4th generation in their family to run the tavern. And again, I just find that remarkable. The next excerpt features Steve Kurtz, longtime resident of Chestnut Hill. And I really like this because he paints such an excellent visual picture of Germantown Avenue from times past.
In Chestnut Hill in 1947, it was very different than it is now. There were only 2 banks. There were many food stores and gas stations and no restaurants. Right across the street from the Conservancy, there was a diner called the Grove Diner, which was really a pretty rough place. The food was even worse. There were also a number of barbershops. There were a number of corner stores that weren't necessarily on the avenue. At the corner of Ardley Street and Benezet Street, there were 3. Jack's Market, George Burns grocery store, and a candy store. Coming up the avenue, there was the Real Market. Johnny Real had a market. There was the Venetian Market a little further up where the Venetian Club is now. Across the street, there was the York Market. It was a great market. 2 sisters owned that. Coming up the hill, there was Marion's Boy and Girl Shop, where everybody went for toddlers and little kids' clothes. And up from that was the Hill Cycle Shop, which is not there any longer. Oh, I forgot Carmen's Shoe Store. Current Carmen's grandfather ran that store. That's where everybody went to have their shoes repaired. And that's what you did. You got your shoes repaired again and again and again. You didn't buy new shoes. On the west side, there was a department store. I think it was called Mrs. Houston's department store. And it was 3 stories and had an elevator. And I can remember going in and going up to the 2nd or 3rd floor with my grandmother buying stuff.
So as a newer resident of Chestnut Hill, I've lived here for about 15 years. I just love to imagine as I walk the avenue, as they say, I love to imagine all the ways, in which it has changed over the years. So the last of these 4 pieces features the very charming Will Detweiler. Chrissy?
I'm Will Detweiler, and I've lived in Chestnut Hill 45 years, I guess, and most of that time I've been involved in civics in one form or another. Currently, I'm the president of the Chestnut Hill Community Center, and it was created by Gertrude Woodward 100 years ago to be the recipient of the building 8419, which she and her husband, George Woodward, donated to the community to be used forevermore for nonprofit organizations of all stripes. We still have the original deed with her signature on it. It's a little over 100 years ago. And the more I go through old records here, I realize the importance of this building and especially its mission. And clearly from the day it was given by the Woodwards, it was to be more than a building. It was to be, I call it sort of like an expression or a spirit of who Chestnut Hill is. And as she said many times, this is a quote from Gertrude Woodward, community house, as she always referred to it, in some measure answering the age-old question, who is thy neighbor? And if that isn't more appropriate today than ever, and that's the premise on which that building has operated for over 100 years. It's a symbol of who we are in Chestnut Hill. We're a caring community.
I just think that's a lovely thing to express. And I have said this before, but it makes me feel proud to live here. So next, I would like to take a brief detour to some voices from a different community, not Chestnut Hill, but rather our neighboring community of Germantown. And I think this is an interesting contrast to hear these voices. This tape is pretty old. It's from 1991, when the Germantown Historical Society with the African American Genealogy Group undertook an oral history project collecting remembrances of older African American Germantown residents. So this is Mrs. Sylvia Beard and Dr. Samuel Beard at their home in East Mount Airy. And they're speaking here about Germantown High School, where Mrs. Beard was a special education teacher and Dr. Beard was principal. And at the time of which they speak, the majority of the students at the school were white. Oh, Chrissy.
Germantown blacks were not ones who protested much. They were well-mannered, and many of them were here because they came as servants to the whites. So therefore, they were accustomed to this role of being subservient. And they were willing to go along with the status quo, but some of us from South Philadelphia were upsetting things a bit. My niece was attending Germantown High School, mostly white, it still was at that time, and she has a very strong personality. So they had appointed her as president of her class, I believe. Well, up until that time, at the senior prom, even though you were president of the class, if you were black, they wouldn't take your picture. So she insisted on having her picture taken. And the woman, the dear soul who was a sponsor, told my niece, you just think you're uppity because your aunt is a teacher here, because they really were not accustomed to blacks speaking out. And my niece was one who spoke out.
They tried to keep her off the cheerleading squad, and she finally made the squad, again with some parental pressure, because they didn't want to do it at first. And the business community at that time at Germantown, Shelton, was still white, and the student body was black. And of course, many of our kids came in from North Philadelphia, and they used to go down to Shelton and Germantown to catch the buses and the trolleys. And the businessmen didn't like that, so they worked out a deal that we had special buses outside the school in Germantown at dismissal time So the kids would get on the buses there rather than walk down the 2 blocks to Shelton Avenue. They weren't, blatantly saying, but it was saying that their customers were a little frightened by seeing so many black students on the corners just waiting for the buses. A large group of black teenagers was just threatening to them, even though they weren't doing anything. But that was just the way things went.
So I'm grateful that these stories and perspectives were documented. And there are many other interviews from that project. And again, it was a project from the Germantown Historical Society with the African American Genealogy Group. Really invaluable documentation. So to shift gears now, away from tape, I'd like to talk a little bit about the actual mechanics of recording an interview, because I hope that this event tonight will inspire you to gather some of your own recorded stories. So I created a few sheets with a whole bunch of information that the Conservancy can share afterwards. And I will preface this with the fact that I actually use my professional equipment just because that's actually what I have. However, you can use a smartphone, and smartphones have really been a game changer. So Chrissy, could you put the first recording tips sheet up? Okay. So most smartphones really have decent microphones and can produce, very good recordings. So your first sort of order of business is you need to choose whether you want to conduct the interview in audio format or video format. You know what I am partial to, or I'm sure you can imagine. If you choose to record it as an audio interview, you can use a free voice recording app. Most phones, I believe, come with pre-installed apps. So my Apple phone came with a pre-installed voice memos. And I understand that Androids come with voice recorder, I think it's called. And then, if you don't want to use those, or if your phone doesn't have those, you can just go to the App Store and, there are a lot of different ones to download, but these are some of the sort of more highly rated ones. So you want to make sure your phone battery is fully charged, obviously, before starting. You want to check your memory capacity. And this is this is the sort of trickiest, stickiest point, because we all have phones of different, generations, and we have different amounts of memory. So check that you have enough memory to make a recording. But voice memos, which is again on the Apple phones, that default recording format is called M4A, and it does not take up very much memory. This is not my strong suit here, this technical stuff, but apparently a 1 hour recording takes 60 megabytes. And then just for reference, there are 1,000 megabytes in 1 gigabyte. So it's not a lot of memory. And you want to make sure that your phone is in airplane mode if you don't want to be receiving phone calls or texts during the interview. It's always a good idea to do like a test run, I think, just to make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing. And when you do the test run, it is essential that you actually listen back or watch back to make sure it's what you want. And you can like adjust anything to make it suit your needs. And then this is something that I really debated about whether to include. I don't want to scare anybody off, so this is kind of advanced. But an engineer friend told me that your phone may default to record in a compressed format, and that's not ideal, because then it kind of records a lot of the ambient noise as well, and you want it to focus on the speakers. So on my Apple, I went to settings, then I scrolled to apps, then I scrolled to voice memos, and then I clicked on audio quality. And once you click on audio quality, there are just two things: lossless, whatever that is, and compressed. And mine was already on lossless, and that's what you want. You don't want it on compressed, but that's how my phone came. It was in that configuration. So I assume that that would be the case for others as well. But if you really want to check that out, that's how you would do that. Okay, let's go to the second recording tips page. So when you are planning a recording, you want to choose a quiet location. And it's funny, I think we all sort of become numb to a lot of ambient noise. Like right now I'm hearing my computer, whirring, and I hear that all the time. You hear ticking clocks, humming refrigerators, and we sort of forget about those things. But when you are making a recording, those things actually stand out. So just try to listen for those things and try to go elsewhere or unplug the fridge, for half an hour or whatever it takes. And then there's always the possibility that there will be other sounds that, happen during the interview, like an airplane that goes over or a truck driving by, and there's nothing we can do about that. But it may feel worth asking the person to pause and, repeat something if that happens, depending on, what they're talking about. So if you're recording audio only, I'm going to just grab my phone, but you want to hold your phone. I don't know if you can see this on this little thumbnail, but you want to hold your phone with the microphone pointed towards the person speaking. And the microphone on a cell phone is at the bottom here. There's my phone, and there's the, where you charge the phone, whatever that's called, charging portal. And that is where the microphones are. So you want to point that towards a person. And ideally, it should be about 6 to 12 inches away from the speaker. That would be the best quality. And I think it's easiest, you could hold it like this. And if the speaker moves around, you could move it with the speaker, but it's kind of a lot of holding. You also could make a choice to turn it towards yourself when you're asking the questions and then turn it back to the speaker. However, that would not be my choice. First of all, I think it's a little bit distracting. Then people are watching the phone and remembering, oh, we're doing an interview. I think it's better to just put it down on a table and kind of forget about it. And you could like stack it on a pile of books or do whatever, makes it kind of in the best proximity to the speaker. So you just need to decide whether you care if you're on mic or not. And then this is just a little tip. I think it's really a good idea to start every single interview by saying, today is October 22nd, 2025, or whatever the date is. I am Molly Murphy and I'm interviewing XX. And you could also identify the location of the interview. Like I'm interviewing XX at her home at 435, Evergreen Drive, whatever it is. And then ask your interviewee to actually introduce themselves. This is just, like full name, date of birth, and age. And that way, all of that information is embedded in the recording, because we can all, label things and hope that the label stays with the interview, but it probably won't over the years. And that way, it's just all of this information is right there. So it's very useful. Now, if you decide to record a video, you can just shoot, a regular video using your camera app, but you want to keep the camera pointed at the person. You definitely, in that case, I would say, do not want to film yourself asking a question, film the person. You don't want to be going like this, because then, the video is going to be like this and make everybody dizzy. That would be a bad video. And one other thing that's very important with video, or very advisable, is you want to record in this sort of horizontal format, landscape format, not vertical format, which would be portrait format, because that is compatible with video. So for instance, if you were ever going to, edit the video or make a short film or something, you'd want it in that format. And this is something like, if you're thinking about videotaping someone, you could also consider setting your phone up on a table and sitting right next to the person that you're interviewing, if you wanted to capture the two of you side by side. Or likewise, if you were interviewing two people at the same time, you would want them to sit right next to each other and then have the phone just be pointing at them and getting the sound sort of from right in the middle of them. And there are always stands that you can buy. There's always some little prop or techie thing. They're not very expensive, but you don't really need them. You can just prop something up against a book or a vase and call it a day. And then one last thing, this was kind of an afterthought, but you could consider conducting an interview over Zoom. And this is something that I did during the pandemic. That really shut down this oral history project because most of the people that I'm interviewing are older. And of course, we wanted to protect them as best we could. But we had this idea to just try doing a Zoom interview. So it was video. And we did it with this woman. Her daughter went over and helped her set up the video. And it was amazing. It was great. And, Zoom just has this little feature where you hit record and it records the whole conversation. And so especially if you wanted to interview someone who doesn't live near you, a relative who lives across the country or whatever, this is a fantastic option. Okay, let's go to page 3. Okay, so after the recording is done, it is a great idea to get a written record to accompany your interview. And I still feel ripped off. I still feel mad about this, but the AI revolution has made transcribing so easy. And I spent so much time laboring during my career over going back and listening to the tape and trying to type as fast as I could to get every word. And, now it's just you upload it and boom, in 3 minutes, you have a transcription. It's really remarkable. And there are quite a few apps that do this. I've listed a couple of the more highly recommended ones. You can get a free account with Rev, and then you just pay a fee per job, depending on the level of accuracy you want. So if it doesn't really matter to you that much, you can get an AI machine generated transcription, and it begins at 25 cents a minute. So very inexpensive, but it'll have mistakes. It will do very funny things like with local street names and just local names. It can't get the nuances. But if you really want it to be perfect, you do have an option to get a human-made transcription, which guarantees accuracy, but that is costly. That is $1.99 a minute. So anyway, lots of different options, and I've listed a few of them here. So next, storage. If you want to conserve storage space on your phone, which most of us do probably want to do that, you probably want to upload your interview to the cloud and then delete the file from your phone. So my recommendation, there are a number of ways you can do this, but my personal recommendation is to use Dropbox. You can get a free account or a paid account. The basic free plan allows 2 gigs of storage. And it's really easy to upload things and use Dropbox. I think if I made an audio recording on my voice memos app, I just click on the recording and there are 3 little dots in the right-hand corner of the file. I click on those dots and then click share. And then you just scroll down through all the different options, ways to share, and choose Dropbox, and boom, it's there. So then you could delete it from your phone, freeing up the space. However, I would then recommend that you download it again. So you have it in 2 places just for good measure. What if Dropbox, I don't know, goes out of business, or what if something happens? It's easy and fast to download it from Dropbox onto an SD card or a thumb drive or whatever for safekeeping. So those are my recommendations. And then finally, I just thought I would mention that if you are really serious, if you're really into this and you want to use a little more professional recording setup than your phone, and you could use, various lavalier mics and different things, and the sound would be better, but honestly, I really think phones do a good job. But you could get a more professional setup. And I think this company, Sweetwater, is an excellent source, both for information and equipment. I've put their toll-free number in there, and they just have really knowledgeable reps who can talk with you, assess your needs, and then recommend, a bunch of different possibilities. And their prices are good. So that is a lot of information to get you started. And again, the Conservancy can share those slides with all that info. And now let's get back to some more voices of Chestnut Hill. Although these two next voices are actually from Windmore, and I am partial to Windmore because I live in Windmore. Anyway, the first is Dr. Tom Fitzpatrick, who is one of our many community members of Irish descent. And he was 93 when I interviewed him in 2018, and he is now 101. So Chrissy, Dr. Tom, please.
My grandfather lived in Chestnut Hill. He was the only long-lived grandparent. He lived to be 100. And he lived on 30 East Willow Grove Avenue. And my maiden Aunt Mary, she lived there with him. And my Aunt Alice and my Aunt Dorothy, before they married, they lived there. But my father had a grocery store just below Willow Grove Avenue. But he serviced all the big estates back then. And it was the only grocery store for miles around except Chestnut Hill. Originally, he delivered with a horse and wagon. I have pictures of that. But then he moved up to a Ford. But I used to ride with him, into all these estates. And definitely Stokesbury. The Sheet Crows over there. They used to call it the Versailles of America. They used to have parties there, and we commoners would gather at the big gate on Willow Grove Avenue to watch the hoi polloi come in for these 3 or 4 day parties. It was Doris Duke and her gold Cadillac, and General MacArthur. They named a couple of roads after them over there. But we knew all the domestics. Everybody was glad to see everybody when we made the delivery, and if they had kids, maybe we'd play a bit with them, something like that. And we used to swim in the fountains, and the domestics, they knew my parents, and they'd take you in and give you cake and milk and that sort of thing. And yeah, it was a beautiful place. It was a crime what happened to that place.
I love his description of we commoners would gather at the big gate. Next is a clip with another Windmore native with quite a contrasting experience from Dr. Tom. Marjorie Pearson was born in 1928, and her home was Laverack Farm, not to be confused with Laverack Hill Mansion. That was pretty recently demolished, I think in 2019. Anyway, Laverack Farm is lesser known, probably because it was demolished much earlier. But it was a French provincial-style country estate, given a major workover for Marjorie's parents by architects Miller, Meggs, and Howe. And Marjorie will make reference to this, but there was a very fancy coffee table book all about that house called An American Country House, published in 1925. And I was looking around the internet, and copies now appear to be going for $500 for that book. Anyway, Marjorie, whose real name was Margaret, was 90 when I interviewed her in 2018. She is no longer living, but here she recalls family grocery shopping and then a little bit about Laverack Farm. So Margaret Pearson.
My family used to shop at Cromie's. It was a grocery store. I remember my mother would call up and she'd have to have a hot lunch for the servants and a cold supper for the servants, and vice versa for us. So she'd be on the phone for a long time ordering groceries. And then Red, who was the chauffeur and a dear friend of mine, who would go and get them, or Cromie's would deliver them. And then I think it became Reels, and they do the same thing there. That was below Willow Grove Avenue, a little bit below Springfield Avenue, as I remember it, on Germantown Avenue.
And your family lived in?
Laverack in Windmore, out Willow Grove Avenue. I had a wonderful coming out party at Laverack and a wonderful wedding at Laverack. It just was a charmed life, it seems to me. We had this big house, we had maids, I had a nanny, we had horses and cows and pigs and chickens. I had my own little white pony called Napoleon, and I have pictures of me riding with my father before school in the morning over all the fields, which are now covered with houses. Just sort of took it for granted that that's the way people lived, but it really was pretty luxurious.
So sadly, I think soon after Marjorie was married, her father died an untimely death, as they say. He was quite young, and her mother could not afford to keep the house. So her mother had to move out, and it was sold to a man who then also could not afford to keep it and eventually just abandon it. So Chrissy, let's play cut number 2 from her.
It lay empty for a couple of years, and I remember going over there with my husband just to show it to him, and the front door was open and there was snow in the hallway, and that just made me so sad that nobody cared. Some college kids, I think, lived there for a while. Finally tore it down, this beautiful place. You know, there's a whole book called An American Country Home with pictures of it, and it had special chessmen as to open the door handles, and every little thing was thought out.
I find it interesting that between Dr. Tom and Marjorie Pearson there, they make reference to 2 of the magnificent local properties that met the same fate of being demolished. So very sad. Anyway, setting tape aside again now, I thought I might share a little bit about my interviewing approach. And I'll give a little more context on this. In my professional life, I almost always conducted interviews with, musicians and critics, whoever I was interviewing, at their homes or their offices or even hotels if they were, just passing through town, rarely in recording studios. And that was by design, because I just felt it was easier for them, but also it's a much more casual environment. And I was always, just a solo act doing both the recording and the interviewing. So it was just me and that person, no crew, no set, and therefore very intimate. And I think just more natural. And, I think that environment usually just yields a more authentic interview. Even if someone is like media savvy, which of course most of these musicians were very media savvy, but it's just more laid back, and I think it means they'll feel less guarded. And actually, I just, in looking back at the interviews, at the tape that I recorded, I think that was definitely the case, that they were less guarded than they would have been if there would have been a whole bunch of people around in a big professional studio. So Chrissy, can you put up the interviewing tips sheet, slide number 4, I guess. Okay, so this sheet, I actually created this for a class of high school students at Germantown Friends School who were taking a class on documenting the pandemic. So it's a little bit hokey, maybe one could argue, in its presentation, but I think it translates well and works for adults too. So I really try to make every interview seem as much as possible like it is not an interview. And part of it is for me. I don't feel, really comfortable when things are very formal. And I just assume that most other people feel the same. And my primary goal is always to try to capture, the most unvarnished, raw and real version of a person. So I try to be that way, myself as well. And I think it's really important to really convey that you are truly interested. I am almost always very interested in whoever I'm interviewing. And I think that people, get a sense of that, and that helps them to enjoy telling you things and talking to you. I think it's important to be empathetic. People are just more likely to open up to you if they know that you actually care. And this is a really important point. I try to be very organized in approaching an interview, but not too organized. So I always have a list of questions prepared, but I don't think you should feel like you have to stick to your list, because I think a great interview, just like any great conversation, it just takes its own shape and direction. So I think it's really important to honor that, to let that happen. But you have to have your list to refer to in case there are things that the conversation doesn't hit. It's kind of, I've likened this to sort of flying a couple kites in the air at the same time. So you've got the one kite that you're trying to stick to, but then the other kite is going off of here, but you have to keep paying attention to this kite. So it can be a little bit tricky, but I think that if you create a really simple list with just bullet points, it's much easier, because then you can just quickly glance at your list and kind of assess, oh, did I hit that, right? And then, it's not like a whole bunch of notes that you're trying to read. It's just at a glance. All right, the next thing may seem very obvious, but it's very important to be a good listener when you're doing an interview, and to really, absorb what someone is saying and respond. And as I mentioned, when you're flying a couple kites, it can be a little bit challenging, because I often find myself, as someone is answering a question, I'll be listening, but I'm also sort of thinking about what the next question is going to be. So it's just really important. If that's happening, just make sure you're not, missing important things that are heartfelt, and acknowledge them. One other little note is, I always try, this is really more applicable for a situation where, you're like doing something for broadcast. In a family interview, this doesn't matter as much, but it's still important. I think it's useful to try not to step on somebody with your responses. We're in a regular conversation, we're used to saying, oh, and, responding audibly, but you really don't want to step on what someone is saying. It's better to try to respond with facial expressions, and you can do that silently, like, those kinds of things, and just not use words. So that's something that is, you sort of have to get used to doing that. Okay, so this is important. You don't want to ask yes, no questions. And to this class at GFS, I showed them a little clip from Saturday Night Live, the old clip, if you are familiar, of Chris Farley interviewing Paul McCartney. And honestly, I don't think they knew who Chris Farley was. And, they may not have even known who Paul McCartney was. I don't know. It was a little bit lost on them, but it's a really funny skit where Chris Farley is so excited to interview Paul McCartney, and he just includes like all the information in the question. So he says things like, do you remember when you did this, thing? And that was just so amazing. And wasn't that so cool? And then Paul McCartney just has to reply, yes, Chris, it was cool. He hasn't asked him a question where he can describe anything. So don't be Chris Farley. Very important. And then last but not least, get real. I think the fact that you're doing an interview and it's not just a normal conversation, even if you're trying to keep it casual, everybody understands it's an interview. So I just think it gives you license to get a little more real with someone and to ask deeper questions that you might otherwise feel awkward asking. So I say take that liberty, but just be, delicate when you do so. Okay, and then the last slide. All right, I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but I just kind of threw this in here because I thought maybe it would be helpful. I put a bunch of sample subjects for interview questions. I will mention the first and the last things on this page. So the first thing, I think it's really useful when you're approaching an interview to have a general arc. I like to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you're interviewing someone, about their life in sort of a broad swath, you should decide whether you want that arc to be chronological. And I personally like a chronological framework. because I think, you just have these natural detours all the time, but then you can just direct the conversation back to not only a subject, but kind of like a time period. And I think it makes it easier for the person being interviewed to kind of remember things. But it's personal preference, so you certainly don't have to do it that way. But then, there are just so many things to ask people about. And often people, take things for granted and don't think they're interesting because it was their life. But talking about, games that they played when they were little, or friends or teachers or slang, language changes so much over the years. Anyway, all kinds of things to ask people about. And then just one note, I think it is a very good idea when you are finished with an interview. So you've asked all of your questions and you're done. And you kind of indicate that to the person. To always ask if they have anything else they'd like to add, because you just don't know what you may have missed. And more often than not, someone will say, no, that was great. But once in a while, someone does have something really important that they want to convey or share. So it's important, to give them that opportunity. Okay, so I want to play two final pieces of tape from two sisters, Alma Fees and Jeannie Roman, formerly the Marcolina sisters. They are part of our very sizable Chestnut Hill community of Italian descent. And they both just made such an impression on me because they have wonderfully detailed memories of their childhoods. And, the soul is often in the details. So here is Alma recalling her grandparents' home on Benezet Street in Chestnut Hill, where she lived as a very little girl, I think only until she was about 4 or 5. So these are very, very young memories for her. Okay, Alma. Chrissy, I'm not hearing anything. I think you're muted. Does that have anything to do with it?
It shouldn't. Let me try this one more time. Thank you.
Yep.
I do remember in my grandmother's house, the wooden cabinets and the ice box, and the man that came and delivered ice that had to be put in the ice box. He had a leather thing that he threw over his shoulder where the ice would drip down. I remember seeing that, and he would come in the back shed door and with the ice pick and put that chunk of ice in the ice box. And it had the latches, I see them. They're wooden, they have wooden doors and the latches, and that's where the food was kept. And the agitator washing machine that agitated, and it had the ringers up top where my grandmother would feed the clothes through. So that right off the kitchen was the laundry, the refrigerator with a round motor on the top, the ice box. And over in the corner, there was a toilet. And they had put up a wall, probably plywood or something like that, with a little door. And my grandfather would come up Benezet Street. See, he worked at the Pennsylvania Tile. And he would take off his work clothes and go to the bathroom. And I remember standing there with the door open talking to my grandfather while he was sitting on the toilet. But that's how we were.
Very open.
And my grandmother used to have to soak her feet for one reason or another. And there was a little step up from that back room into the kitchen. And she would sit on that step with a basin and put her feet in. And I remember putting my feet in with my grandma. I was very close to my grandmother. And then you went through the kitchen, and then you'd be in the dining room, and I can see the dining room, and that's where the phone was. And I remember being taught that I would pick up the phone and the operator would come on, and I'd say, could you please call, because now my mother had a house on Moreland Avenue, and they were getting that ready. The number, I can't dial. And they would connect me and I could talk to my mother on the phone.
Meaning you can't dial because you were too little?
Well, I was little, and it was a rotary phone, so my little fingers, I guess, could not spin the rotary phone. So all I had to do was say to the operator, and she would connect me.
I mean, she has so many memories from being such a little girl. And I just love that she, you know, in describing like the icebox with its latches, she's saying, I see them. They have, you know, wooden doors and these things. I feel like I am in her grandmother's house, kind of walking through it with her in the way that she describes that. All right, finally, I want to play a poignant clip that is just wonderfully unvarnished. And this is Alma's sister, Jeannie. And Alma had brought up a traumatic childhood memory of watching a fire. So I asked Jeannie if she had any, you know, similar traumatic memories, because sometimes that kind of a memory can make almost a greater impression, you know, and become very formative. So this is Jeannie's response.
But when you mentioned this, what came to my mind was the year we all went out to buy a Christmas tree. And we usually bought two. One that was the one we were going to decorate, and the second one for the wreath on the door or for fill-in branches. And Daddy would drill holes and fill in where we thought we needed more fullness on the tree.
Oh my gosh, I've never heard of that. That's
very artistic.
Take that, Martha Stewart.
Yeah. Exactly. So we're on the porch, and it's an enclosed porch, and it's wintertime, so Daddy tells me to close the door to the porch. Well, as a kid, I used my backside, and didn't the glass shatter and went all over the place? And then it started, my mother said, weren't you happy with the tree that we bought? And I thought, oh, that had nothing to do with that fact at all. But I felt terrible. I know I remember how bad I felt, and bad for my father. But the thing is, I just couldn't wait to get it up and get decorating. But to think that I broke the front glass, and
you're right, something's just so startling like that.
Yeah, and you know, so yes, traumatic things did happen to me, but until someone like you asks me that question to really think about it, and it's funny that should come to my mind. And it really meant a lot more than what I allowed it to.
Yeah.
That I hurt or offended my father. And now, after all these years, that I'm here tearing up over something like that.
So I just think Jeannie so beautifully demonstrates there how telling our stories can just tap such emotions, both for the storyteller and for the listener. And I think that's what gathering oral histories is about. These stories about places, about experiences and emotions really bring us together. They nurture connection, they nurture empathy. And whether it's in a community or in a family, they stand as a permanent record, ensuring that these experiences and these stories are not lost over time. So my advice is to sit down, roll some tape, as we say, with family or friends or even an interesting neighbor. It definitely does not have to be formal. And don't wait until the end of someone's life. I think it's really important to gather stories early and often. And you can involve family members, you could involve a grandchild, just make it fun for everyone. So in conclusion, I would just like to thank the Chestnut Hill Conservancy for inviting me to share all of these thoughts and recordings with you tonight. And I hope it's been informative and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. That was absolutely fantastic. For those who might, well, first off, I'm Alex Bartlett, the curator and archivist at the Chestnut Hill Conservancy. And for those of you who might not be aware, and also for those of you who perhaps need a reminder, we actually have over 100 oral history interviews that have been conducted in various times in our past, including those that Molly Murphy has conducted, including with me, yours truly. And we're trying to make those available online, but we certainly invite you to contact us, contact me, if you'd like to know more about them, and also about all the other amazing things that we have in our archive. By the way, not just documenting the history of Chestnut Hill, but surrounding areas. Molly has mentioned Winmore. We cover Springfield Township, Germantown and Mount Airy, and of course the Wissahickon Valley. So by all means, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. You can reach me at alex@chconservancy.org. So that's alex@chconservancy.org. And it doesn't have to be about oral histories. It can be about anything sort of history related in association with Chestnut Hill and vicinity. So I do remind you, feel free to ask questions using our chat feature. And I will now turn it over to Rob Fleming, who will moderate discussion. Thank you.
Rob, I think your sound is not on, your audio.
Thanks for
There
that
we go.
reminder. What
Yep.
I said was I just got a little message on the screen saying I've been spotlighted on my video for everyone. And unmute your microphone if you want to speak. Okay. And I've just done that again. So you can all hear me, I take it. It's really quite wonderful, and I can't wait to be interviewed myself. And I think my wife, Susan, who's sitting next to me, feels the same way. And the thing that strikes me most is how engaged each of the interviewees are, how much they seem to enjoy it. And I think that wouldn't happen if the tape wasn't rolling. You know, if it's just a conversation, tell me about yourself, that's one thing. But when you know it's recorded, you really get into it. At least that's my impression. Now, so far, no questions have appeared, but the staff and I have, here comes one. We have some questions at hand, if there's not a cascade of questions, but I encourage everybody listening to ask them, and I will transmit them. And we do have a question here. Do you establish a time frame before starting the interview?
It depends on the person. It depends largely on the person. And I don't really do that because I don't know. I think that, again, an interview, like a conversation, it kind of just naturally unfolds. And some people love to tell stories. They love to talk, and some people do not. And so I would hate to set up some kind of expectation, either that it needs to be a certain length and then that stresses someone out and they don't have enough to say, or that it needs to be a certain length and they can't speak as much as they otherwise might. So when I do these, interviews with people in this area, I think some of them, like one was only maybe 40 minutes. And then I've done others that have been 3.5 hours, a number of them, 3.5 hours. So I like to let the person decide that. And I like it to just be a natural thing.
Well, I have a question. It's about your experience with the high school students at GFS. What's your evaluation of how good they are as interviewers, and is it possible that they may be quite the appropriate bunch of people to interview elderly people about their histories? How did that go for you?
It was a really interesting class. So it was a class about documenting the pandemic. So they were interviewing local, shopkeepers and just local merchants and residents mostly. And it was actually remarkable. I thought they were fantastic. And I think I mentioned this to someone, but they did everything, they were sort of organized in teams of 3 to 5 people. So one person would be holding, a big boom mic. Another person, they videotaped all of their things. So it wasn't just audio. Another person would be, manipulating the camera. And then another person would be asking the questions. So it was kind of a team effort. And then they would just take turns so that they each got experience in each of those different roles. And they were just great. I think that, by and large, the Germantown residents and merchants who were interviewed were just really happy to connect, especially with young people. So it was
During a pandemic.
Yeah, during a pandemic, right? Everybody's like happy to connect, period. So it was really successful. It was great.
Did any of them interview their kids, their parents, I mean? Did any of the kids interview their family members?
No, because it was just focused on really trying to document the pandemic in Germantown itself. So
in the community.
That community, that particular community. It came out of a project that was happening. The former archivist and curator at the Conservancy, Liz Jarvis, was doing a similar thing with some students at SCH. And actually the way it happened is she asked me to help her with it. And my son, who was then, a junior, I think, at GFS, he overheard me talking about it and talking to her. And he just commented, wow, I wonder if Germantown is having a very different experience of the pandemic than Chestnut Hill. And I thought, wow, it would be really interesting to, explore that. And so he was very involved in that class as well. So that's kind of how, the context, that's where it came from. And it was really interesting. And then he actually ended up taking it farther, and he did a junior project where he just did that himself. He did a 30-minute film about the pandemic in Germantown. And it was amazing. Yeah.
Here's a quick question. Is any paperwork required giving legal permission to record and share an interview?
Yes, I always ask people at the end of the interview to sign a release. And, in my professional world, it's like a broadcast release. It's written in a very particular way so that it can be used for a broadcast. But this one for community members is a release that's been written by the Conservancy. Alex, I don't know if you want to say
and we require it in the archive for any oral histories and transcripts that we receive, because otherwise we're ultimately operating in terms of sharing with the public. And if we can't share an oral history with the public, it's sort of nice to have, but why have it if you can't really disseminate the information to like a researcher who is looking for a specific topic? So we in the archive also require a release form.
How has working on oral histories changed the way you think about memory, truth, or storytelling?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know. As you mentioned earlier, I do think when you're making a recording of something, people are on higher alert. and they are more actively reaching back into the recesses of their minds and remembering things. And it's really a wonderful thing to watch happen when someone just starts remembering things and they just start flowing out. I was thinking about a recording that I did with two jazz musicians, and they both had spent a lot of time in their younger years in Washington, D.C. And I thought that this recording was going to be a really difficult one. It's hard to control two people at once. And it was just the opposite. I had them sitting right next to each other on a couch. It was Dr. Billy Taylor, who was a pianist and educator, and Frank West, who played in the Count Basie band. And they hadn't seen each other for a long time, first of all. So it was exciting to be together, but one would mention something and then it would spark the other one's memory and they'd bring that, something new up. And it was like they both played off of each other. So I love to see how doing an oral history with someone really can bring memory to the forefront. But I will also say that sometimes people do, misremember things here and there. Some people do that, just for the art of the story. So there's always that.
As a follow-up for that, is there a particular oral history that stayed with you?
That's a hard question. I don't think so. It's funny. It's like after each one, I usually think, oh, I'm so engrossed in that one. And they've all been so different. As I mentioned, Alma and Jeannie really impressed me because they just had such command over details. And so those, I just think that the details in a story, the things that you remember, the little tiny, things that you can recall that create the larger picture. That's, as I said, where the soul lies. So
were they in the same room when?
No, I did them at different times. Although when I interviewed Alma, Jeannie was present, but I was interviewing Alma, and then a time, short time later, I went and interviewed Jeannie. But just fascinating to hear the experience of the Italians who came to Chestnut Hill, these immigrant families and tile workers, and it was very, very hard. People came over and then worked for a while and then tried to bring their families over later, and it was very challenging.
They were isolated culturally.
Yeah, and they were like a very tight community. So very interesting.
We have a person who's has a, or I don't think it's hypothetical. There's a collection of dozens of Girl Scout history interviews, but they're all on tape, and no one knows how to transcribe them, and they're worried it's going to be very expensive to have somebody transcribe them. Do you have any shortcuts or suggestions about what to do with an old collection like that?
And do we think that means cassette tape or reel to reel?
Well, I'm guessing cassette. She says they're from 40 years ago, so that sounds.
Yeah, cassette tape, she says.
I see.
So you mind, Molly, if I pick this one up? Yeah. So at both the Chestnut Hill Conservancy and the Germantown Historical Society, we have they still do make tape decks, heaven forbid, dual cassette decks that we all had, like for those of us who were around in the 80s. But they're, made recently, and they have software that comes with them that you can install on your computer, and then through a USB port, you can connect the cassette player up to your computer and actually get the audio from the cassettes. And I've done it. It's surprisingly easy. And then there is a program that converts the raw audio file footage. I think it was the program was called Audacity, if I remember correctly. It converts it into like a usable MP3 or MP4. And it was surprisingly easy. The tape deck, I think, was around $100 or so. It might be like 120 now, but my point is it was very reasonable. And we digitized countless numbers of cassette tapes, old cassette tapes at both the Conservancy and at the Germantown Historical Society. So it's something worth considering, and it's totally affordable.
Well, then I think Melissa could contact you for more details. I think that's a pretty good answer to our question.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. This is another good question from the same person, Chrissy. How can an interviewer navigate his or her own emotions or biases when the story touches on personal or family baggage? The interviewer's personal story.
How can the interviewer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
if the interviewer happens to have a hang up that.
Yeah. I mean that it's difficult, and I will say this brings up, like, when you are interviewing particularly a family member, there can be a lot of baggage. It can be very complicated, and this isn't really about, baggage per se, but I do have a confession that I promised Chrissy that I would actually make this confession. I told Chrissy I did not have the guts to do a proper sort of oral history interview with either of my parents before they died. And I really regret that. I did do recordings of a sort with them, but it didn't occur to me to do it on my phone, because I was thinking they don't live near me, so I'm going to have to fly there and I'll have to bring all of my equipment. And so that's already a thing, and it feels kind of formal. And I just I don't know what held me back. I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable if there's sort of, a feeling of like an end of life sort of activity. And that's why I was recommending record with family members, especially early and often. And I just think, in going back to the question about baggage, there wasn't any awkward baggage with my parents, but it can be a very weighty endeavor, period, to ask someone, in this sort of format about their lives. Because as you say, it's an interview. Everybody kind of knows it's an interview. And so, you have to proceed delicately and decide what you're willing to address and how you will respond to everything.
Although it'd be a lot easier if
it's going to be recorded.
Yeah, although if the person who's nearing the end of his or her life is asking for the interview, then I think it's probably okay.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I was also going to say, there's nothing saying that one can't just record themselves too. It's certainly more interesting to have an audience and be telling these stories to someone. But you could set up a camera and start just getting stories down and document yourself. Anyone can do that as well. You don't have to wait for someone to ask, although I get that it's not as interesting.
Somebody just asked if the program is recorded. It is, but and Chrissy, can you confirm it's going to be on YouTube? Is it not? Or will it be the website of the Conservancy?
Thanks for asking. It is recorded. It will be shared with everyone who registered for the event. So a direct link to the recording along with the materials that Molly has graciously provided us with. And it also will be on YouTube.
Okay, great. I think we're nearing the end of our time together.
I just thought, Rob, I thought of one other thing that I'd like to mention, which is StoryWorth. Are people familiar with StoryWorth?
Sure are.
Did someone give you a gift? a gift of Storyworth.
Decades-long project, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of platform. And it's funny, my husband tried to organize something with his parents, but I think it felt like, a lot. They're supposed to be writing all these reflections, one a week. It was sort of too many prompts. But, for some people, that might be wonderful. And then, of course, the company will make a book afterwards, but it could also be recordings. And then, I guess they make some kind of compilation. But that's something that it's an interesting concept and maybe worth checking out.
One last question. Have you thought about interviewing ChatGPT?
Have I thought? Right. I mean,
just turn it on and start it,
just have a conversation. I know. Well, you can do that. You can have amazing conversations with ChatGPT.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's right. We all have to be creative in a way now where we're just 1, 2, or 3 steps ahead of it to even have the creativity to figure out how to use it to your advantage. I mean, it's amazing. The world is changing quickly.
Well, we have an attendee who had a couple of comments, really, or by way of advice about the technology of compression.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. And
so if you see that, rather than me reading it to you, why don't you?
Yeah, I'll take a look at that. And as I said, that's like a little bit outside my wheelhouse. I'm not really I'm not at all an audio engineer. I just know, I just record with my equipment. I know how to, do things in one way. So I was getting advice from a couple other engineers. So I'll take a look at that, and I appreciate that information.
Okay. What do you think, Chrissy? Are we about ready to call it a night?
Yeah, I think there were a couple other comments, one from Dara. I didn't know if you wanted to read those. Obviously, comments about great presentations, so thank you.
And apologies to her, I was scrolling up and hers was the very first. And I'll quote, she says, "I always say, what haven't I asked you that I should know about?" People always end up disclosing something that way.
It's a great question. Yep. It's sort of right along the lines of that, is there anything else that you'd like to add? But that's an even more specific way to get someone to really think about something.
Yeah. Well, I think that pretty much clears the written questions that people submitted. So.
I'll add just one other thing that I'm so conscious of how much we all tend to capture. Like cell phones allow people to be documenting their lives constantly in a way that, we never did before. I personally have like over 100,000 photos in my, Photos app, and photos and videos. And I just have so much stuff, me walking through the yard, talking to the deer, and, little things like that. And I often think, my poor children, like what will they do when I am gone? Are they even going to look through all of this? Like, how does one organize this stuff? So we have this huge quantity of documentation, but it's often just not that thoughtful. Some of it might be, but that's why I really think it's wonderful to just keep remembering that if you try to document in a really deliberate way by doing something that's like an oral history, or just saying, sitting down with someone and saying, hey, let's just hear a couple stories today. And it's very deliberate. That's so important. And I think it's kind of easy to forget to do that.
That's awesome.
I see David's image coming up. Do you have anything to add, David, here at the end of the time?
Hey, yeah, I just actually, I think was going to wrap up. I just really want to thank everyone. My name, for those of you who don't know me, I'm David Guest. I'm the executive director of the Conservancy. I just really want to thank Molly and Alex and Rob and Chrissy for putting this all together with the program committee. I thought this was a completely excellent presentation. Really appreciated it. I'm relatively new to oral histories, and as others know, I'm relatively new to sort of our archival work as well. And this just, I've gotten really excited about a lot of our archival materials that are, physical in nature, but hearing the audio, right? I mean, and I know some of the people you had recorded, or I've gotten to know some of them recently as well. So that was fantastic. So just really appreciate the depth of what you've provided, the work you've done, Molly, and the tips for people who want to do this work on their own. So thank you very much. I think this was already addressed, but just to confirm, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar to people who are on and registered, and we will also be sending out the handouts that Molly prepared with all those tips. And just encourage everyone to continue to check your email for emails from us about other programs we have going on. Look at our website as well. We have a lot of additional great programs coming up this fall. So thank you all once again. Really appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for who was involved in this presentation. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
It's fun.
Thank you so much.